everyone, here's how I put together the Creations by Mache pattern 120, the dress version. And I do have a version for the sunsuit that I will link below. So to begin, and this is optional, but if you want to do any embellishing for that collar, go ahead and do that before you cut out that pattern piece. I did some shadow work on embroidered stars, and I have a detailed video on that I will link below. And once you are done with any optional embellishing, then you can cut out that front collar piece, and you will also have one front collar piece for the lining as well. Then you'll have two collar back pieces cut on the fold and one dress front cut on the fold, as well as one dress back cut on the fold. First, I gathered the neckline around the entire neck. I moved my needle over to do one row of gather stitches, and then I moved it the other direction to do the second row. The idea of two rows of gathers threads is that your permanent stitches will go between the two rows, and having two rows keeps your gathers nice and neat instead of going crooked on you while you sew. And if I'm not mistaken, the pattern calls to gather just between the notches, but when I did that, I didn't like the look. I just thought it looked really clumpy. So I pulled out those threads and gathered from one shoulder to the other shoulder. After that, I joined the front to the back at the side seams with French seams, and I have a detailed video on how to do French seams that I will link below. Then I ironed the French seams towards the back of the garment. Next, I finished the underarm area. To do this, I took a 2-inch wide bias strip and folded that in half and gave it an ironing. Then I sewed it to the underarm area of the dress. And then I trimmed up those raw edges just enough so I could turn that folded edge of the bias band and have it reach the machine stitches. And I'll use these machine stitches later on to hand sew this band in place. If you've seen my other videos, you know I like to save all my hand sewing until the end whenever possible. So for now, I'll just iron the band down. So moving on to the collar. Now this is optional, but if you want to have piping or lace or ribbon or whatever on the collar, this would be the time to add that. And I'm using this delightful piping sort of ribbon stuff. I'll link it below. On the front collar, you could start on the shoulder edge and then turn that corner to the collar edge, but the pattern calls to only embellish that curved part of the collar. So that's what I did. Remember, the seam allowances are 5/8 of an inch. A little unusual for children's clothing, so just a friendly reminder. And so that's why you see the piping is moved over so much from that raw edge. And I repeat the same process to the back of the collar. So now I can attach the collar to the dress. I folded the collar in half and gave it a gentle ironing so I could roughly find center front. Then I pinned the center front of the collar to the center front of the dress. I sewed the two together with the collar facing up so I could go right on top or even slightly inside of those previous stitches, attaching the piping on. And this gives a really neat transition between the piping to the fabric without any gaps. Anywho, this is what your collar will look like, and I machine sewed those bias bands into place, kind of like folding them over, if you will. It just sort of looks like this. So then I put the lining of the front collar right sides together and sewed it from one side around the shoulder down the neckline to the other shoulder and back to the other side. And then I trimmed up the corners and seam allowances as well as clipped around the curves of the neckline. And finally, I turned the collar right sides out and used this little pointer tool, it's linked below, to push those corners before giving everything a really good ironing. I ironed the bottom edge of the lining of the collar under, since this will be hand sewn into the machine stitches later on. And I repeated the same thing to the back of the collar, gathering the dress, pinning the center front to the dress, and after sewing that together, pinning on the lining to the collar and sewing those two together. And at this point, we are almost done. I turned the raw edge of the hem up twice and ironed that in place. And normally I would hem by hand, but I sort of thought, I was like, I wonder if I can just get away with machine stitching this one. So that's what I did. Don't tell anyone. But I guess you could finish this raw edge with some lace or trim or whatever. It's sewing, you do you. And finally, after adding some buttonholes and hand sewing those linings into place, here is my finished garment. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below and I will do my best to answer them. And as always, I appreciate y'all for watching and I hope to catch y'all next time.